Every day, the best part of the newspapers for me is the first thing I read is the cartoons. People who know me realize that I find a lot of truth that comes from the comics that we find in newspapers. When I was in seminary, there was a gentleman named Robert Short who wrote a book entitled The Gospel According to Peanuts. And it was a book that talked about the cartoon character by Schultz, but did it in such a way that it brought up many of the meaningful aspects of the Christian faith. I have an autographed copy of that, in fact, at home. And the second book they wrote later on wasn't as popular, but it was also called The Parables of Peanuts. And so sometimes I would hang up these cartoons in the church with a little statement about it to help people understand what it was about. So I want to share with you today from Peanuts, a story, a cartoon, that will kind of talk about the 3 points that we found in the book of Ecclesiastes today. It involves Charlie Brown and Lucy. Lucy says to Charlie Brown, "I have a riddle for you, Charlie Brown. What are the 3 things in life that are certain?" And Charlie responds, "Death and taxes." "That's only 2, she says. "You're right. I know what the 3rd one is, but I just can't seem to think." Don't tell me. "Rats. I seem to have a mental block or something." And of course now the cartoon goes on to Lucy, who is holding a football. And Charlie Brown is running as fast as he can. And just when he gets to that point, Lucy lifts up the football and Charlie goes flying in the air and says, "Now I remember." Reading Charlie Brown. "Rats, I seem to have had a mental block or something." It's so aggravating when you're trying to think of something and meanwhile, Charlie Brown is running as fast as he can. He's running toward Lucy, who is holding the football, ready to be kicked. As he gets to it, of course, what does Lucy do? She picks up the football, Charlie goes flying through the air and says, "Now I remember!" Wham! Down he goes on the ground. And then Lucy says to him, "It was so obvious, Charlie. It was so obvious." Football is back with us, and so it was apropos that since Schultz has died, that we have a timely comic strip once again showing the futility of Charlie Brown trying to kick that football. 3 things in life. He knew about death and taxes, but he forgot about his history with Lucy Brown, and a lot of us fall into that category. During our time together, we've been going through Thessalonians, which has talked about the early church. We think is really Paul's letter to the church at Thessalonica. It's not reading today, but we've been reading a couple of times through that. In which Paul is doing a couple of things. He is trying to support the congregation in Thessalonica. He's trying to encourage them and praises them for their faithfulness, because they are living a time that is very dangerous, a time when there's a lot of persecution. And it's hard, really hard, to hold on to the faith. And so he was encouraging them to hold on to the faith, keep going with what is true and right and just. And he was praising them for their ability to do that, all the people in the congregation. In the readings from Matthew, especially chapter 22 and 23, we have been dealing with the frustration that Jesus had with the certain scribes and Pharisees, whose only intent was to try to trap him, find some reason to make people doubt him, and then finally to be rid of this rabbi, this teacher, who was saying things that seemed to be so radical to them and so against them. Last week it was their hypocrisy, how they do all the right things externally to show their religion, with the frontlets on their head and the ribbons on their prayer shawls and all these things, and the long, long prayers, and all the outward trimmings, and nothing of the internal part of what the faith is all about. As we approach this holiday season with Thanksgiving and Christmas, we always run that risk. We get so trapped up in the trimmings and the decorations and celebrations of Christmas, we forget that it is about the birth of Jesus Christ and the light that's come into the world. And Advent will soon be starting, and today we have some examples of ideas of what the kingdom, when it comes, will be like. And then in chapter 24, which has not been read in a lectionary, we have what we call the little apocryphal readings. These are readings of the last times. It's a dark passage from Matthew 24 about the sky turning black and the stars disappearing and all those things that talk about the end of the earth as we know it. It's kind of like a little similar teachings we find in the book of Revelation. A lot of it is in code, once again, to give support and encouragement to a community that was under a lot of difficulty with people coming after them. So today we come to Matthew 25, the first part of it. And we had the story of the wise and the foolish bridesmaids. There are some problems with the story, which I'll get to, because if you look at every aspect of a parable and try to dissect it part by part, we run the risk of losing what was the main intent of the story. For example, we have the story here of the bridesmaids. Now, weddings were very big back in those days. Most of the weddings were arranged. And there was the betrothal of the bride, where they would make a vow to be husband and wife together. And then there'd be some negotiations going on with how much dowry that the groom's family was going to pay. Why are they paying, the bride's family. Why the groom. Why are they paying the dowry? Because the bride would be leaving that family, a worker in that family, and going over to the groom's family to live. And so to pay for the loss of that person, there'd be a dowry set up to be paid. So they were in the process of negotiating that. And then wedding celebrations took 5 to 7 days. That was, of course, before COVID-19. 5 to 7 days it would take for a wedding celebration. First, they would have a party, and then celebrating the promise of betrothal, and then they would have going to the families and all around the town, hundreds of people involved in the celebration. And then it finally become the time when the groom would come to pick up his betrothed and take her to the big banquet celebration. And that's where we pick up the story this morning. The groom is late getting there. My wife would tell you oftentimes that when we're late to anything, it's my fault. She's nodding her head yes, in case you don't see that action out there in the congregation. It's usually my fault that we're late. It happened again today, picking up Beverly. So the groom is late, and the bridesmaids have fallen asleep. And suddenly there comes the shout. The bridegroom has come. And they get up to meet him. And they bring their lanterns out. But the 5 foolish bridesmaids, who are not only doing their job right now, but also losing the opportunity of meeting some eligible bachelors. That might be their choice or the family's choice for them down the road. So they're quite upset about this. And they ask the 5 wise bridesmaids, give us some oil. Now, this is where we think about this, because part of us as Christians say, well, of course, I'll be happy to share some oil with you. I'll be happy to do that, However, today, if I took what's in that lantern and try to put it into this lantern and share it, they both wouldn't work, because there's not oil in there, there's batteries. And unless I had extra set of batteries, which I don't have, they'd both be not working right now. That's what would happen if I tried to share. But this parable is not about sharing. This parable is about preparation and doing your duty. The bridesmaid's duty was to light the path for the groom that was coming to get his bride. Without that, he would have a hard time, perhaps, at least theoretically, it's a parable. To bring the bride into his house to be his wife and have a big banquet meal. So they had a task to do, preparing the way, lightening the way for the bridegroom. Of course, in this parable, we know who the bridegroom is. The bridegroom is a metaphor for the coming of Jesus back into the world a second time. This is a parable that talks about the second coming of Christ, which we'll be celebrating during the Advent season. We celebrate the birth of Christ during Advent and the coming of Jesus as a child. But also we look forward to the coming again of God's reign upon earth with the second coming of Christ. That's what the two Advents combined together are truly all about. And so, in the story, the bridegroom, Jesus, is wanting to come, but he needs to have people who have lit the way, people who have been sharing the light and the love, so that when the bridegroom comes, things will be prepared for him. Preparation is extremely important. If you know that a storm is coming, what are the first things you do? You go shopping. You make sure you have extra batteries. You make sure you have enough food for the family to last in case you can't get to the store for a while, especially bread, milk, eggs, those kind of standard things we buy. You make sure your gas tank in the car is full if you have a car to drive. If you know there's going to be a strong wind coming, you might also want to take some plywood and board up your windows and make sure, if you have shutters, make sure if they work, that they're closed. It's natural for us to prepare for the coming of the storm. That's what this parable truly is all about. Unfortunately, if you don't do it, there comes a time when it's too late. When the storm is upon you, you can't get out, you can't get food, you can't put stuff over the windows, you can't hop in your car and drive to a safe place. So when the foolish bridesmaids come to the door and say, "Let us in, we now have the stuff," it's too late. It's too late. On our journey in the Christian faith, we can encourage other people to join us on that journey, but we can't make them. The door is always there for us to open, but we have to open it. We can't do it for somebody else. We can encourage them to try to do so, but we have to take our own responsibility to prepare in a way in our own lives for when the time will come when we will meet our Master, Jesus. And nobody else can really do that for us. I always say to people, if it wasn't for Sunday mornings and the congregation coming to meet me, I'd never have a sermon written. We need to have those kind of deadlines. We need to have those opportunities to be able to share God's word. And this parable is all about that. It's about preparation. It's about recognizing and doing the job that God's asked us to do as a congregation. Today you meet for an annual meeting. During the annual meeting, you'll be making decisions based upon your faith journey and what this church can or cannot be going forward in the future. It's going to take preparation, which you have been in the process of doing. I know I've spoken this week to Susan and to Fran, and I know that Marcia, who is your pastor here, has helped pave the way for you to think about some things that are very important as you go forward. And I've asked permission to kind of stay around today and just listen and be supportive as you talk about some things today and even next week. I'm not going to be here for the future of this church going forward. And I know that you'll be preparing the way, no matter what you decide, for the light to come into your life and the light to come into your community of faith. Amen.